and thank you for the kind introduction. And welcome to everyone who's joining today for this talk, Zero to App in 2 weeks, or Why Do Some Developers Struggle? My particular role at Microsoft as part of the Windows ecosystem team, well, let me explain what that team does as a whole, is that we have a very large engineering group that builds the Windows platform. There's thousands of developers and testers and program managers and marketing people and everyone who actually builds the product. But that product doesn't really do very well in the marketplace unless we have a lot of partners in what we call the ecosystem, the people that build PCs, that build accessory hardware, the people that build software, the people that have training companies or consulting businesses or work in enterprises that are dependent on this platform. There are literally billions of people around the world that use the platform and also build their businesses around that platform. And so the Windows ecosystem team is the group of people that cultivate those relationships, make sure our partners have the information they need in order to do their business properly. And last year, when we did the Windows 8 consumer preview, which was in February of 2012, we wanted to start getting the Windows Store populated with apps. And we had people going out, actually since 2011, talking to different software partners, seeing who was interested in getting onto the platform really early. And we took a number of those people in hand, and people like myself and others in my team really worked one-on-one or one-to-many with these companies, working with their development teams, with their product managers, with everyone who was involved in producing that product. And so we got a lot of frontline experience in building some of the first apps for the Windows Store and just watching the evolution of development going on after our consumer previews and developer previews and so forth. In that process, it was interesting to watch how some companies were able to produce an app in very little time, and I think the record was 2 weeks. I won't mention any of the names of these companies here, but there was one company I worked with that it was actually very shortly before the Windows 8 launch last October that they came on and said, yes, we want to make an app for this platform, and we had some good keynote talks in the launch and stuff that would have worked really well for them. And so I partnered with them, and we had, from the first meeting where we talked about what the app was going to do to it being in the Windows Store, was 2 weeks. So that's really the record of producing a pretty decent app for the platform. At the same time, some of the other partners I worked with and others in my team worked with seemed to just limp along for months at a time, and we would ask, why are they struggling so much? What was going on with these companies versus the ones who were doing stuff quickly that made all the difference? So this presentation is really my codification of what I experienced and what others in my team experienced, what would really make the difference between getting an app built quickly with good quality and or as the opposite, taking too long to do it. I will point out that you see in the subtitle of this talk, you have a URL to my personal blog, kraigbrockschmidt.com/blog, and that question P equals 265 is a specific blog post of this title where you can find all the bullet points that I'm going to be talking about written out. So a lot of the slides I have here are just, as you'll see with the next one, just pictures with a few phrases and so forth. So the first principle that I want to bring up as far as something to consider and the principles of really being productive on this platform is to really just commit yourself to the project. Some of the people that I found, the developers who really worked well, just said, we're going to do this project. They put all their energy behind it, and they didn't think that they weren't holding anything back really and saying, well, we're trying to balance this against that, and we're trying to balance all these things. And one of the reasons I point this out is because this is not a Windows Store app doesn't have to be an 18-month decision for a first version. It's going to be an ongoing concern, obviously, because you want to commit to the platform. You want to put your energy behind the app ongoing. But with the evidence that you can build a pretty good app in anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks, it's not like you're committing a year and a half of your development energies. You're just committing a few weeks or maybe a month or two to that. And so when you understand that that commitment isn't so long, and you can then have the app in the store, do some other projects, and then come back in 4 to 6 months when you have feedback that you can incorporate and issue an update. And an update might only take a couple of weeks to produce as well. That the commitment you're making here is not a commitment that, oh, I'm going to be burdened by this for so long. It's you can put your energy behind it for a few weeks and really fly quickly. Like, that's why I picked the picture of the space shuttle here, really blasting off into orbit and carrying all that energy with it. The ones who produced the best apps also really showed a dedication to producing the most excellent thing they could on this platform. Now, Windows 8 has a lot of unique features. It has a lot of things that it shares with other mobile platforms and things like iOS and Android and so forth, but there's also things that are unique. The people that really did well said, just let us know what's truly unique about this platform, how we can make the best app that runs here. We're not going to worry about how things work on other platforms. The partners that we worked with who brought all this, all their understanding or assumptions about other platforms to Windows 8, they struggled a lot because they were thinking it should work a certain way, but it really works in its own way. So I really encourage people to say, just completely accept the way the platform is. Don't try to fight it. Don't try to struggle against it. Don't wish things were different than they are. It's really a good human principle in life, after all, that if you accept reality as it is, you can then work with it constructively. If you spend most of your energy wishing reality was some other way, then you really won't get very far in any aspect of life. So success in writing apps is accept the platform as it is, commit to it, try to avoid picking up little things that you wish were different and turning them into, as the adage goes, turning molehills into mountains. There's no reason to do that in the kind of time frame that you're looking at for producing apps on this platform. The next thing that we saw was really important is being able to use the experience that you have. If you've looked at Windows 8 at all in the developer platform, you'll see that we have a number of choices of what language you use to write apps in, what presentation layers that you're using. So you can write in C++ and DirectX, which is used typically for high-performance graphics. You can write in C# with XAML. You can write with Visual Basic in XAML. You can write with C++ in XAML. And you can write with HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, really taking the advantages of knowledge that you have on a web platform and using that to actually build an app using the languages that you know. So this is a little bit of a contrast from the prior slide where we talked about commitment and not bringing too much of your assumptions from other platforms and too much of your assumptions from prior experience to bear, but of course you still want to leverage your experience, so there's a balance to play here. It's important to understand that when we're looking at app projects that could take as little as 2 weeks, and typically we saw that 6 to 10 weeks is pretty well average with apps that really do a good job. I will mention one name because the Twitter app that came out a few months ago, I worked with them personally on that, and that was about a 6 to 10 week project, and they were really committed to making the best app they could with the best features, the best integration with the platform that would truly shine on Windows 8. So in that time frame, 6 to 10 weeks, that's not enough time to really have your developers and your testers and everybody else pick up the details of a new programming language or the details of a new presentation layer. When we were first getting the ability to build apps on Windows 8 back in late 2010, early 2011, when we were just doing that internally at Microsoft, we had lots of interesting discussions around, when developers come to this platform, what should they choose as a development language in a presentation layer? And we went all around different answers to say, well, maybe JavaScript is easier for people, but then DirectX is more powerful, and maybe you know C# and XAML already, and went around a lot of gyrations. And where we ended up with that story was to just look at it and say, you know what? You want to use what you know. Because the effort to pick up a new paradigm, if you're familiar with HTML and CSS and JavaScript, going into C# might be okay, but going into the XAML presentation layer can be really strange. I know I have more experience with HTML and CSS, which is why I wrote the book on that. that particular approach. I look at XAML and I don't quite get what's going on. I've never quite picked up how to think in XAML, and part of that is I worked at Microsoft many years ago from 1988 to 1996, and then left the company for 12 years. Didn't do much with technology, and I completely missed the .NET development. And so by the time I came back to Microsoft in 2008, there were all these people with 10 to 12 years of experience, and I just couldn't quite get my head around it. So I said, I'm much more familiar with HTML and JavaScript. Let me focus on that, and that's what I did with my book. I will mention, because it's a free ebook, it doesn't cost you anything to get it. Even if you do work in other languages than JavaScript and HTML, at least half of the book is really just about the platform and the Windows Runtime APIs. So you can acquire the book for free, and it'll have a lot of good discussion about those platform characteristics. Even though the examples I give are in JavaScript, much of the book doesn't have anything to do with the language in particular, especially if you go to a chapter on, say, live tiles and working with services. That's all on the server side and doesn't have anything to do with your language in the client. Anyway, back to this particular point about using your experience is, when somebody has known C# and XAML, trying to pick up HTML, which is one spec, JavaScript, which is another specification, CSS, which is another specification, understanding the WinRT API and the Windows platform and the Windows library for JavaScript that you use in these apps, that's a lot of stuff to bring together, and I don't think people can learn it effectively in a couple of weeks. So definitely use your experience, but also be flexible, like I say here, as the situation demands, that if you encounter something that's problematic, and this is something that we've tried to help partners understand, is, oh, here's your design, and we can see that you're going to want to do certain things like this, but there are certain things in the platform that you might trip over. There's, for example, right now in the platform, something that we'll be improving in the next version is that to embed web content in a page into an app's presentation using HTML and JavaScript, you need to use an iframe element. Well, if the website that you want to embed happens to have frame-busting code in it, that won't work. And so the only choice right now is to use the web view control in XAML, which then forces you to use C# or Visual Basic or C++. We'll be improving parts of that story, but that's just a point-in-time kind of decision that people have had to make. That we do know about, that we'll be improving as we go on. But basically said, just don't listen to what other people really have suggested, like, oh, I think this is the better choice. Find the right choice for you, find the right choice for your app, and you'll have a much better experience that way. So my next little slide here, I had if you're not quite reading Old English, I know we have a lot of international visitors. I say, make it thee thine proper assumptions, which means that make good assumptions when you approach one of these projects, and don't just assume that, like I said before, that things will work a certain way from prior experience on other platforms, including experience on Windows and the Win32 API on the desktop. That's really a different platform in and of itself. I use this picture in the background because you may know the story from ancient seafarers, or not ancient, but back into the Middle Ages, where people thought that there were dragons over the edge of the earth. They didn't know what was out there in the ocean. And they would draw maps like this that had a label that said, "Here be dragons." And they would just assume that there were monsters out in the sea until somebody finally got on a ship and went out there and just noticed it was water and found some land and found new cultures and other people, and that's how we came to know the world for true. But the reason why I mention this is that at the beginning of a project, if you're new to Windows 8 and you're just starting to spend time with it, take a few days especially, and it maybe only will take a few days, to really try to grasp what the platform does, how it works. I suggest especially Chapter 1 of my book, because I tell the platform story. Here's all the different features of it. And just read through the introductions of the chapters in that book, because then you can get a really clear sense of what's in the platform, what it does, what it may or may not do in comparison to other platforms, and you can really get a good grasp of what it is you're designing for. We saw some designers that would start on an app project, and they really hadn't spent any time tuning into what Windows was trying to do and how it was trying to present an experience to the user across all the different apps and the platform. And they would make these assumptions and build it into the designs, and we'd have to come back and say, that's just not going to work very well for you. I don't think you're going to be happy with the result. It's going to confuse users if you design, if you take like a desktop design or something from another platform and think, I'll just copy that over wholesale. Well, with the Microsoft design language that you've seen in Windows 8, with the way we try to use typography, the way we try to have the Chrome and the commanding structures off screen that come in with flyouts and things, transient UI like the app bar, that there's a certain set of principles there, and if you try to just pack your app screen with lots of different commands in Chrome, it just won't look and feel like other things in the platform. And so to be consistent across all the apps, and users are going to be using your app and other people's apps together and interchangeably, sometimes sharing screen space together, then you want your app to really cooperate well within that space and not just assume it should work this way because that's our specific branding or something like that. The other thing I'll make with this, a point I want to make here is that if you have an assumption that you're not really sure is true or not, ask. Just always feel free to ask. We have great forums on MSDN. If you go to msdn.com, or actually the Windows 8 development site is dev.windows.com. That'll take you to that portion of MSDN. And you click on the forums link there, you'll get to, there's many different forums, some for design, some for tools, some for the different language and presentation layers. And they're very well staffed. People are very responsive there. And you can just say, I think this is how something should work, but please double check me. And I often answer many questions there. I know lots of other people do. You can use Stack Overflow for this as well. There's pretty active communities on Stack Overflow around Windows 8 and the Windows Runtime API. So it's best, like any course correction, if you make a very small adjustment at the beginning of a project, it's much easier than making a huge adjustment later on when you realize that an assumption just isn't going to pan out. I'll also mention, as a practical measure, this isn't so much about the platform as it is with your own structures and your own, especially if you have a back end. One app that I was working with, Kayak, if you go out to the Windows Store today and find the Kayak Hotels and Flights app, we were working with them early on for the consumer preview of Windows 8. And we was working with a designer from a design agency who worked with Kayak and got some idea of what they wanted. And they came back with really beautiful designs that had like these full screen images of hotels as the backdrop to a details page for that hotel. But the problem there was that Kayak, in their back-end service, which was built for websites, mostly has graphical assets between 300 to 500 pixels in any dimension, height, or width. And they had to come back and say, you know what, we don't have pictures of hotels that are this good. We have a lot of small pictures, so we need to design around that. And that's an important practical consideration. Make sure if you're relying on back-end services and back-end data that you know what's available, you know what you can get, and you design the app experience around the availability of those particular assets. Okay, next is a very, very important thing to also spend time on, not just spending time understanding the platform, but really understanding the tools and the resources that you have available to you. I point this out because some developers that we worked with, feeling confident as developers and maybe even confident in the platform, weren't necessarily experienced with tools like Visual Studio or Blend for Visual Studio, which are part of the free tools that we give for Windows 8 development. And there's also the Visual Studio Ultimate set, which has more tools if you're going to do driver development or desktop development stuff. You need those. But they kind of made, again, going back to assumptions, they assumed they knew enough about the tools to just dive into development. And I really encourage people to take a few hours at least, especially if you're new to Visual Studio and Blend, to just experience and play with the tools and find how to be productive with it. In my book, in fact, I made a video that is part of its companion content that is an introduction to Visual Studio in 10 minutes. To say, here are just the core pieces of Visual Studio that you really need to know for 80 to 85% of the work you're going to do in the tool. And I made that because we would encounter lots of web developers or people from other platforms that come into Visual Studio. And if you have experience with Visual Studio, you know that it's a huge environment. It's got so many different commands and so many capabilities. It's been described by some people as like walking into a 747 cockpit, where there's all these controls and you don't know, how do I just fly this plane and get it off the ground without all the details? So I made a video for that in my book to say, okay, here's the basics about coding and debugging, setting breakpoints, using IntelliSense, what your project structure looks like, and with that, you can be very productive. So I really encourage people to spend time with the tools and making sure they know what's going on. But then, speaking of resources, the Windows Developer Center that I mentioned is one of the best sets of resources we've ever put out for a version of Windows. I've been around Windows since version 2, and back then we just had printed books. But gradually it became harder and harder as the API set expanded to really make sense of it all. The Windows Runtime API is smaller than Win32, and so what you use to write Windows Store apps is not nearly as complicated as Win32. It's small enough right now that one person, like myself writing a book, can understand the totality of it. So it really makes a lot of sense to spend some time getting familiar with the API, just going to the Dev Center, browsing the namespaces, expanding all the little nodes in the table of contents just to see what's there. You can tell a lot by what's in the namespaces and what kind of object classes are around. And then I strongly encourage people to go to the samples on the Dev Center, download the entire set of them in whatever language you're going to be working in, and spend a good day or half a day even just looking at the names of the samples and then going into ones that you think are interesting. Because we have in those samples 95% coverage of the Windows Runtime APIs. So for the most part, for just about anything you need to implement as far as the platform is concerned in your app, when you say, well, I need to do, I want to do live tiles, or I want to do secondary tiles, I want to implement the search contract, I want to work with certain things in layout, or I want to work with animations, I need to figure out how to work with what we call pointer input, which is how we unify mouse and touch and stylus all together. You want to learn how to use sensors or geolocation or all kinds of other things in there. There's a sample that shows you the details about how to do those things. Each of the samples has multiple scenarios in it where they demonstrate and flex the different aspects of the APIs. So I know that for myself over the years developing, sometimes all I need is a simple example that shows me how to call this function. Because I tried doing it, I read the documentation, I tried making a function call in my code, and something isn't working, so I need a piece of code that does work, that I can reference. That's what the SDK samples are all about. Now, let me go to back to the app that we did in 2 weeks. One of the things I did as soon as we finished our very first meeting where we scoped the design and said, okay, this is what we're going to do, I sat down taking all the knowledge I had and wrote this 8-page document that says, here's the samples that you need to go to for these. Well, here's the features in the app that we need for this UI that we've designed. Here's the APIs that those use. Here's the samples that discuss those APIs. And here's the scenarios in those samples that you want to go to and steal the code and put it into your particular app that we're building. So by going off and borrowing the code from the samples, you really do have a good half of your coding done there if you know where to go borrow them. So again, spending a few hours, if not a whole day, just familiarizing yourself with that fabulous set of resources will save you a lot of time and trouble in your development efforts going forward. So definitely borrow that code and leverage it as much as you can. Again, I'll mention that one of your greatest resources is the community with the forums on MSDN and Stack Overflow. People are very active there and very responsive and give good answers. And I should also mention that if in your particular project you'd like to get something done but you lack certain skills or don't quite have the resources within your organization to apply to a project, there are many design and development agencies out there now that have really picked up and specialized in working with Windows 8 and working with this platform, as well as working with Windows Phone, if you want to stretch onto that platform as well, who can, even just, you might hire them for a few days to really get something off the ground, to get a project started, or to do certain testing aspects or to develop certain pieces for you. So there's a lot of resources out there that don't mean you're completely outsourcing the project, that can work even on an hourly basis with you to get certain things done. I will mention my book again, and I'm not making this plug personally because I don't make any money on the book. We give it away for free. I wrote it as part of my job as an employee of Microsoft. But what I really tried to do in there is give voice to the engineering team. So in my position, I'm one of the few authors really that can write for the outside world and understand what real developers need, because I've worked with them directly, but I also have very deep contacts within the engineering team. So if I need to know how something works, I can go to the people that created it. I can have them walk me through it, and then I've turned around and communicated that in the book itself. So a lot of the sections that you'll encounter in that book are really the voice of the people that created that technology, and as much of the deep understanding of why they did what they did, the choices they made, and how to really use that technology to its greatest advantage is expressed in the book. So that's what we try to do, and that's why we give it away for free, is because it's really the voice of the people that created the platform. And I don't want to underestimate that resource. It's not something I consider just my work or my personal work. It's really the voice of the engineering team. So definitely use that. It is an 833-page book, so it will take time to get through it. But like I said, just read the first chapter and then read the introductions to the remaining chapters, and that you can do in a couple of hours and get a lot of good insight. And then you can search through it, in fact, and find contextual discussions of, if you want to know, say, for example, how secondary tiles work and why secondary tiles exist, I have some sections in there that introduce that subject and give you that context without overloading you with the details. So the other thing besides, in the tools, the last thing I wanted to mention with the tools is, now Visual Studio is really meant for your development and coding efforts. Blend is something you want to also pick up and get familiar with, because it's really how you work with the UI. So I've worked with the HTML and CSS side, and I can say without hesitation that Blend is a fabulous CSS debugger. So if you ever see something in your app where it's not displaying like you think it should, and you're in Visual Studio, and traditionally people have thought, well, I got to go look at my raw CSS, I make some tweaks, and then I run the app again, and I get back to where I was, and then I see if I got it fixed. Well, Blend shortcuts that whole process, so it gives you, the app is actually running inside Blend with all the JavaScript loaded, all the dynamic elements have been created, and all the script context is there, all the styles have been applied. You can switch between this thing called interactive mode, where you go to interactive mode and you're inside the running app. You can navigate to where you want, get a selection or whatever state you want to set up, and then leave interactive mode. And then you can basically click on elements and see exactly what CSS is being applied from which style sheet or which computed value, and figure out exactly where the problem is in a very short amount of time. So that, again, is a tool that's just absolutely essential to learn, especially if you're working in CSS and JavaScript and HTML. It also works for XAML too, so you'll have lots of different capabilities there. Now I just realized my screen timed out, so I have to log back in again. Give me one moment because I cannot see my screen. There we go. All right, let me go to the next slide now. Okay, scoping the design. Very, very important point. The apps that we saw took a really long time did not start with this. They didn't start with a clear picture of what they were trying to do. I love this illustration of this photograph that I found of, here's this TV set or computer with all these different bells and whistles and gizmos and things hanging off of it that, might be a really neat product, but, you all know that this kind of stuff never succeeds and just confuses users. That's the only thing it succeeds in doing. So if you come to an app, especially on Windows 8 for Windows Store apps, that are meant to be focused and meant to be tailored to a certain purpose, as they run full screen, or within one of the other view states where you're only sharing the screen with one other app, and not just trying to compete with the desktop space, you really want to scope your app to do something specific and do it really well. The app that we did in 2 weeks was very simple in scope. It had a total of 3 different pages that we had to design, kind of its master page, its detailed page, and its search results page. And with that simple scope, there was a lot of focus on what's the flow between these 3 pages, what's the experience the users are going to have, and by honing that and polishing that, we really made something that would work and be an exemplary app, but also be very simple to implement. So if you can scope your design, keep a focus from the get-go, you can make your first version of the app, do some things really well, and once you're in the store and you start getting reviews and ratings and customer feedback, then you start getting a clear picture of what you should do in your next version. What can you improve? How can you add to that experience without, again, getting sidetracked into all kinds of different considerations or concerns or feature creep or those things that typically happen to apps. We have noticed that when the companies that got sidetracked on trying to do too much all at one time ended up rewriting things a lot. They would spend too much time re-architecting their app or saying, okay, we need to pull this in and that in, and it just took months and months and months to get that kind of thing done. And in an app store, when you're trying to get a presence there and get some customer base built, you really just, again, want to focus on doing something well. What's very important to understand here, too, is that the way the Windows 8 platform has been designed, it's very easy to update apps. And often maybe you've seen on the web where you'll put one version out and then you want to release a new version, and basically for your customers that would create a new download of the entire app again. I can think of an example of this, Camtasia, which is a screen recording application for the desktop that we use a lot to do videos. And when they put out an update, the update package, the whole app was 200-some megabytes as a download, and then the whole update was another 200-some megabytes as a download because it was just the new version of the app. But the way the Windows Store works is that anytime you change your app package, and the package is the unit of upload that has all your executable code and your resources and whatnot that you need that gets downloaded to a client machine. We break that package up into a series of blocks, and there's another file in there that gets created called a block map, and those are 64K chunks. And when you issue an update, we recompute that block map so we can see exactly what part of the app actually changed. So if you go and you make one bug fix that only affected one block, and you have a 200 megabyte app that was the initial download, when you issue that update, the only amount that the user has to actually download is 64K. And I don't know if you've gone into the Windows Store. If you have, and you've seen that there are many updates for different apps you have, and you go ahead and say just update everything, you'll see that some of those are completing very, very quickly. And that's because they may be as little as 64K to actually update a certain feature. Maybe it's 128K, maybe it's 256, maybe it's 1 or 2 megabytes, but compared to a large app, it's not that much of it doesn't impinge that much on your consumers to actually download and install that update. So because updates are quite easy to do and relatively painless for your customers to install, then think about that in your app development cycle, that you can do something first that you do well and then issue incremental updates such that each one does not, you can build those features without requiring the user to keep downloading the whole thing again and again. It just doesn't need to happen that way. And also remember that your development cycle is shorter because you can write really good apps in a matter of weeks and not, in the 18 to 24 months. Find a good design, lock on it, go at it, get that app done, and then produce your revision. And then, keep a cycle like that that's agile and and looks at the short scope rather than the long scope. Of course, you want to have your product plans be long scoped, but each iteration doesn't need to take that long. The other thing I will mention, going back to the example I gave with Kayak, is do also pay attention to your back end. If you have a back end service that you own or that you work with someone that your app is dependent on, make sure that your app developers are talking to your back end people, because in some cases, as you're developing the client front end, you'll realize that you need certain capabilities. You need to be able to run certain queries on the server or obtain certain kinds of information that maybe you don't have the right API interface to the web service to actually return what you need. So you need to work with the back end and polish that to make sure that the app has as streamlined of a communication with the server as you need it to be. All right. Second to last slide here, having clear, efficient, and appropriate methodologies. I'll go back to the, I think I mentioned it in the prior slide of the getting sidetracked and rewriting stuff all the time, and partners who kept thinking they needed to rewrite how they structured their app, just ended up delaying that app for many, many weeks because their methodology was such that it wasn't attuned to a short duration time cycle from, say, 2 to 6 to 10 weeks. What we did with the 2-week app that worked really, really well is that little 8-page document I had mentioned that I wrote after our first design meeting. What I also did in there is said, okay, here are the different pieces of this app that can really be developed in isolation. We have a team that needs to work on some of the back end. We need a team that needs to work on kind of the navigation flow elements. And then we can have a team that can work on some of the more peripheral stuff, or I don't say peripheral, but the platform integration areas. So there was a group of people that just worked on the live tile experience for this app. That they wrote a module that could then be plugged into the main app with the UI flow, had a very specific and clear interface, and it integrated in basically it took about an hour to join those two projects together, and then the app really just worked that way. So because of the short time frame that you can develop these apps in, you got to really think in parallel and how to make methodologies that work in parallel rather than the things that are working more as the waterfall methodologies, or things where, let me just mention one of the partners that seemed to take forever, seemed to do everything by a committee. Every time they wanted to do anything, they had to have all these meetings and all these things, and it just took a long time to do anything. Again, because you can update an app so easily and it's a relatively painless experience for the consumer, then you don't need to try to solve every problem perfectly every time. You can really make those adjustments. So knowing what you could do in isolation is very helpful. And that, again, comes from knowing how the platform works and how things relate there. So that's why that investment also works well. Having, again, the clarity around your design is very, very helpful, because if you don't have clarity of what you're trying to do, then, again, you're going to get sidetracked. The other thing that I will mention is you really do need to have a good testing methodology. With the HTML and CSS and JavaScript option that you have for writing apps, and that was created so that web developers could bring their experience to bear on writing Windows apps. However, one part of that experience is very, very different in that when you're dealing with a website or a web app and you deploy it to the web and you see that something doesn't work right, and you can fix it very quickly, it doesn't require as much upfront testing as it does when your turnaround time for getting a new update in the store is maybe on the range of a few days to a week. So, whereas you can go out to the web, you can fix an error in 5 minutes. To fix an error in an app that's already in the store means you need to rebuild the package, upload it to the store, and it has to go through the certification process again, which can take as little as a day or two, but we generally tell people expect a week. So if you think that your cycle for updates is a week versus 5 minutes, then you definitely need to be putting a relatively larger amount of time into testing the app before you actually submit it to the store. one of the partners we worked with early on, they were coming from their web developer was really creating this app, and he was a very sharp guy, but didn't quite have this understanding, and he was also the tester. So it was a very small shop, and they just had one product manager and one developer tester kind of person. And everything was working great. As far as he was concerned, the app was ready to go. He submitted to the store, and it got rejected almost immediately, saying that when we run the app, the home page comes up blank. And so I tried it, and sure enough, when I just made a new installation on a fresh machine, it came up blank. And the problem there was that the developer had never actually tested that app on a fresh machine or a fresh device, which would simulate how a customer would receive it. And so we discovered in that what he had been doing is he has all this cached data that had been built up from queries to the web service, and that was all on his development machine. So every time he ran the app, all that data was there. But on a fresh machine, the data hadn't been cached, and it was fortunately a very easy problem to fix, but was very evident that the testing methodology from a web experience does not quite apply in the same way to an app experience. So you want to make sure you're really going through the paces of testing the app and making sure you try it on different devices, testing the performance, learning some of the performance tools that are in Visual Studio is very helpful. And I'll also mention that Microsoft has set up what are called app labs in different cities around the world. I don't know quite where the list is, but I think you can easily search for it. And I think on my blog, there's an older post on my blog, I believe, that has a link to it. But we set up these different labs where we have all kinds of different hardware for developers to come in and test their apps on these different pieces of equipment to see how they perform on ARM devices or ones that don't have quite the performance capabilities, how they work on large screens versus small screens with high pixel densities, and all those different variations. So we've set up that resource to help with your testing efforts as well. So my final slide here, let me move to it, is the last one. The last point is to ask the right questions. Now, when I was working with partners, directly working with their development teams, I really noticed that there was a lot of variation on how their developers approached their own work personally. Some developers would seem to ask questions too soon, before they'd actually they'd played around with the feature enough to know what was working and what wasn't, and they would ask too soon, and they didn't really have enough context for a valuable answer. Other developers would take too long to ask. They would go down a road making certain assumptions, hoping that things would work out in a certain way, and then by the time they got to asking me a question of why wasn't this working like I expected, we had a lot of code and a lot of work that had to be unraveled, a lot of structure within the apps that had to be unraveled. So really the point there is to find, and this is a hard thing to gauge because it's very personal, but to try to find a point where you feel like you've done enough work, but you're starting to go down that path of diminishing returns, where you're getting stuck and you're just going to start trying things randomly to try to figure out how the system works. I'll tell you a funny story with that is typically when you're working with a released platform like Windows 8 is, you can really figure out in many ways how the system works by poking at it, by trying things with the APIs, trying things in your code and seeing how it actually works, because the system is actually released. Well, I can tell you this does not work when you're working when you're trying to develop against an operating system that's still in production. So when we were first building apps for Windows 8, the first time we really could was in December of 2010. When something doesn't work, you don't know if it's your code, you don't know if it's a bug in the platform, you don't know if it's a bug in the tools, or just something isn't working right. So if you try to figure out how the system works by poking at it and by trying things with the API, you really don't get the right results. You can kind of do that with a released operating system, which is where you guys are working with. But still, there's a point at which you're going to start trying to do that, where you want to start investigating the system just by how it behaves when you call functions in it. But I would say at that point, it's not going to be productive anymore, and that's the right point to go out and ask a question on a forum, or somebody that you know, a friend, another developer, and just try to see, okay, I got stuck here. I don't want to waste my time going down all these different roads and just experimenting and writing random code or fiddling with styles and things like that. Let me ask somebody who can actually help me and give me insight onto this. I typically say that if you're spending more than 30 minutes to an hour working on a particular thing, and after about 30 minutes of trying some experiments, if you're getting stuck at that point, go out and ask, because it'll save you a lot of time and trouble. Find another feature you can work on during that time while you're waiting for an answer to come around. But I can tell you, on Stack Overflow and even MSDN, oftentimes you'll see an answer there within half an hour, 2 hours, even a couple of minutes. I know if you ask something on the JavaScript forum on MSDN, I have the RSS feed for that coming directly into my email. So I've often answered questions within 15 minutes of them being posted, just as if someone had sent me an email, and it's a very productive relationship to have in that way. So, I enjoy this political cartoon that if those of you who weren't around the news of the United States in earlier this year, there was this thing we had called the fiscal cliff, where all these tax laws were going to expire, and certain things were going to happen that people thought were just going to create an economic mess. And our politicians were, of course, bandying all these things around and not knowing what to say about them. So, here we have the elephants representing our Republican Party and the Democrats represented by the donkey. And so, they're about to go off the cliff, and what they're talking about is what kind of lunch to have. Which is really the wrong question to be asking. So, but I really want to mention that because sometimes I had people asking me questions that were far too low of a level. They were isolating a line of code that wasn't working. And without the context around that, it's hard to say what's going on. And so often I've had to ask, well, what is it you're actually trying to accomplish here? And when I get that answer, I see that they've actually gone down the completely wrong road, and they need to go down a different road to solve that particular problem, because they didn't quite know how things would work. So if they'd asked the question even of themselves earlier to say, what am I trying to accomplish? Is this the right way to go about it? That's a kind of good question to ask before you invest too much time and trouble. I remember there was a question somebody asked about how we work with roaming data and data that gets roamed through the cloud between different devices. And because the person asking the question didn't explain their context and their assumptions, which weren't correct, all the code they were showing, and they gave me lots of different pieces of code, it's like none of it worked because they just had written that code on the wrong assumptions. So with that, we do have some time left in this webcast. I do thank you for your kind attention, and that concludes my part of the presentation. And if you have any questions, feel free to post them, and Yasmina can relay them to me, and I'll answer them the best I can.
Thank you so much, Kraig, for an outstanding presentation, and we have many questions that have come in, as you can imagine. So folks, we'll just take them in the order that they came in, and we'll start with a question from Dom. The 2-week app, as it is a mashup of existing SOA web services, or does it include a full server-side implementation?
So in that particular case, the app is a front end for a back end that has been used on the web, and the same company is used for different platforms. So they have a very mature and powerful back end that does most of their work, and the client app was really querying data from that service, presenting it in a very useful and engaging way in the app. And then when you selected something in the app, it would go out and get the next piece of data, get details, and bring it down. So they didn't have to develop that whole back end from scratch. That was very much in place, which of course helped the time of development. If you're going to do both a back end and a front end at the same time, yes, you're going to have to take longer.
Thank you. Next question here from Ravisara. Are there any limitations on the kinds of apps that can be made solely with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, or can you develop any kind of app for the Windows 8 platform?
There aren't that many limitations. Where you get into is mostly with performance. For example, there's been, if you look at some apps, especially ones written in DirectX that do like a parallax animation in the background where you have different layers that are scrolling at different speeds. We haven't in the Windows 8 platform today been able to find a good way to implement that with JavaScript and HTML. We'll be making lots of improvements as we go forward to the platform to enable those scenarios to work better. But right now, that's one where the performance, especially on an ARM device like a Surface or other tablets, just isn't going to give you the results that you want. And so people that were really needing that kind of experience, we would try to direct them either toward XAML, which was better, or toward a DirectX implementation, which would perform as well as possible. But if you're really working with typical kinds of layout content, working with web services and so forth, there's really not much that we've seen. The few points, like I mentioned, between iframe and WebView are one of the very few instances where some characteristic of the platform forces you into using a certain kind of a certain language and presentation layer. But by and large, we've seen a lot of really good stuff implemented with JavaScript, and the fact that if you need higher performance routines, like for certain kinds of manipulation or computation, it is possible to write what we call WinRT components. That's the same way that the WinRT API itself is written. But you can write those components in a language like C++ and get the full benefits of compiled code execution and have those results then passed back into the JavaScript layer. The one thing you can't do between there is share UI. That's not something that the platform is capable of doing at this time. But you can write those components in more optimized languages and use libraries and so forth to do that. So you can really get the best of both worlds. You can write mixed language apps and not have to think that you're forced into using just that one language for a particular solution.
Thank you. And we have a couple of questions from folks asking about Windows 8 and PhoneGap, if it's possible to integrate and to support cross-platform app development.
So I don't have much experience with PhoneGap myself, but I do know that I believe they are looking at this Windows 8 as one of the other platforms they want to fully support. And other libraries and other companies are really trying to work on that as well, because they know it's a need to have a code base that can very largely be shared between Windows and iOS and Android and Windows Phone and things like that. So I don't have any specific recommendations, unfortunately, but I know that there are people in the ecosystem that are very invested in providing solutions there.
Thank you. Brent says he really liked Blend as a standalone app. Is Microsoft committed to keeping Blend or killing it off?
I can't answer that because I don't work in the tools team. So as far as I don't know either way, and even if I did, I probably couldn't say.
Great. Let's see here. Ronald would like to know, in regards to the tools that you talked about, are there any tools to assist development of apps that will meet Section 508 accessibility requirements?
I don't know offhand. It's a really good question, but I don't have the answer. Sorry.
Okay. And Earl says, based on your contact with commercial app developers, what percentage are actually using C#, XAML versus JS and HTML or C?
Let's see. I don't have exact numbers on this. I think roughly right now, I think of apps in the store, it's somewhere that probably 50% are C# and XAML, and probably the rest are split between JavaScript and C++ and DirectX. The big reason for that is, and we totally expected this, is because people who have been Microsoft developers in the past, who are often the first ones to come to the next version of Windows, have been working with the .NET languages in C# and XAML primarily. And so they've been the ones producing the most apps at this time, and also if they've come from the phone, they're C# and XAML experienced as well. And so we expected to have the bulk of apps being written in that language first, but we did the JavaScript and HTML option knowing that there would be a long tail of developers that would be coming in later and over time that would see that as the right option. So we expect that the proportions will probably equalize over time, and I would expect to see really a pretty much even split between the different choices, because in some cases, like if you're going to write a high-performance game, you're going to do C++ and DirectX. Most of the the big game titles that you see in the store today are written that way.
Thank you. And another question here from Dom. Does developing a Windows 8 app versus Windows Phone app versus Windows Azure require a completely separate development effort, or can a single app work with minimal changes across all three technologies?
So let me first clarify that for Windows Azure, Azure is a server-side operating system, and what you're writing there is services primarily, or services that an app would take advantage of. So in that case, you're not talking about phone and Windows 8 as a client are different concerns. So you're not on Azure not really creating the same kind of experience. If you're creating a website, you're using web technologies for that and hosting it on Azure. But if you're writing things with mobile services or using their service bus and things, that's really about server-side concerns for the most part that apps then take advantage of. As far as the phone and Windows 8 is concerned, right now they are separate tools and environments that way, but we definitely know that those need to converge. And one of the big drives with the Windows Runtime API is that for Windows Phone 8, you will see that a lot of the Windows Runtime API are shared between both the phone and the Windows platform as well, and that will just continue to increase.
Super. And we'll take one final question here from Earl, who would like to know if you have recommendations for tools, books, tutorials for people learning about Windows 8 app development.
That's a really good question, and not one that's easily answered in a short amount of time. There are quite a few books out there now. I know that O'Reilly publishes a number, Microsoft Press publishes a number. That the ones I've looked at are pretty good with the different presentation layers and languages of concern. I do recommend that the Developer Center dev.windows.com has a lot of great resources in it. Early tutorials and things to get started, and is really one of the best places to go. I would actually ask this question also in the forums, both on MSDN and Stack Overflow, and just get other people's opinions about that, because every developer is different. They have different ways of approaching things, different writing styles and books that they like. Whether they jump into code first or jump into understanding the structure of the platform first. There's just different approaches and different styles. So I would say use the forums primarily to ask that question and get some good recommendations from people who have probably read more books than I have, because I'm primarily writing them and don't have a lot of time to read and review everybody else's.
Perfect. And with that, folks, we are going to say a very big thank you to Kraig for presenting a really outstanding webcast for us all today. Thank you so much, Kraig.
Okay, and I will mention on this last slide, you see my blog, and I have my email address here, so feel free to drop me a line if you have any questions. If it gets too involved, though, I might bump you to I do have limited time, but I do certainly welcome your correspondence.
Super. And folks, we'd like to let you all know just a couple of announcements here. We did push out some codes and some URLs to you all in your group chat. So if you didn't open it, please open it. Good information there for you. First, we'd like to let you know that we made available the access to get Kraig's ebook. It's a free ebook. You can download it, look at it, start learning and using it right away. Also, Kraig is speaking at our Fluent Conference. O'Reilly's Fluent Conference is next week in San Francisco. We still have some tickets available, and we can save you some money, so a code and a URL to get you there. Also, Kraig is speaking at Microsoft's Build Conference in June, and we pushed out a URL to you all there. There's going to be a lot of resources and free events and webcasts that you can watch after the fact, and even probably during the session there's going to be good resources posted on that page. So Microsoft Build Conference, check that out as well. Kraig, thank you again. Folks that attended our event, we thank you for attending and hope you benefited from it, and we look forward to seeing you all at our next webcast. This will conclude today's event. Thank you so much, everyone. Goodbye.
So long.